Hello, everyone. This is Nina Olson, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Taxpayer Rights. And we now have I believe this is our 9th tax chat. And we are going to talk about notices and communication from the IRS, but also just learning a bunch about how best to communicate, send information out to folks. This is a key issue because this is part of the IRS Strategic Operating Plan, which I will come back to. But it's also something that has come up throughout all of our tax chats that we've had so far, how the IRS communicates with people. Do people understand what they're being asked to do? And this is not just an issue that the tax agency faces. It's something that tax agencies and other agencies around the world face, how best to communicate with folks. And the University of Communication has expanded so much because of technology, which is both good and bad. And this is part of what we're going to talk about today. I also encourage you to look back on some of the past tax chats, particularly part 2 of artificial intelligence, in which Josh Blank and Leo Sofsky talked a great deal about simplexity. And we'll come back to that as we go on in our conversation today. So we have a great lineup of guests. Michael Hallsworth is from the Behavioral Insight team. I first met Michael, I think we decided about a decade ago when I came over to UK to visit him and learned about the work that he was doing over in UK with Her Majesty's Government and Customs, Revenue and Customs, HMRC, which is now His Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And some of the really interesting work that they were doing over a decade ago. And now he's based in the US now, and he's doing some very interesting work with countries around the world and also some other state and federal agencies. We also have Josh Beck from the Taxpayer Advocate Service Attorney Advisor Group, and he's going to talk about some of the work that TAS has done over the years with notices and some things to think about going forward. And then our third guest is Julie Payne, and Julie Payne is from IRS Chief Counsel, but right now I guess you're detailed, correct, to the IRS Transformation Office to work on some of the projects that are the initiatives and projects that are part of the IRS strategic operating plan, looking at what can be done with the funding that the IRS has gotten under the Inflation Reduction Act. So just a few things. We want everybody to remain muted except for the guests, but you can certainly put things into the chat, comments, anything that you may want to mention, talk about. We're all monitoring the chat and we will weave it in as we go along. So Michael, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, and you have some slides to show, I think.
That's right, I do. Thank you. Thank you, Nina. And thank you everyone for joining today. I'm going to do the thing where I try and share my slides, and can you see them?
Yep.
Okay, and it should be large now. Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, I'm going to give you a brief tour of some things that we've learned over the years around taxpayer communication. First of all, I'll say quickly where I'm coming from. As Nina mentioned, I'm the Managing Director for the Americas of the Behavioral Insights team. We're an organization that applies behavioral science to improve public policy and service design. We were created inside the UK government back in 2010 as a kind of pioneering organization, I suppose, that's been replicated in many countries worldwide. Today, we work with many levels of government, nonprofits, and a certain number of private sector clients to apply behavioral science to improve societal outcomes. Now, what are we, in relation to this talk today, what can I offer that may be interesting to you? Well, I think the first thing to say is that across literally hundreds of studies now, we know that the design and language used in notices influences behavior. I can give you many examples. There are some simple ones. Here's some work we did with the city of Hartford in Connecticut as part of the What Works Cities program that is a national program, helps to use data and evidence more effectively. If you just redesign the notice to make it clear what you have to do to say, here's how to pay, to make it very salient to attract attention, and then you run tests to see which one has a great influence on payment behavior, for example, you can see that quite consistently you might get 3 percentage point increase in payment rates, for example, for, in this case, parking fines. There are many other examples. And as I go throughout, many of them concern filing or payment behaviors. And that's simply because over the years, those are the kind of things that tax authorities have been understandably interested in. And those are also relatively easy to measure. But there are other examples, and this is also applicable to, for example, better communication to help people's understanding of what they need to do, better relationship with the tax authority, reduced inbound call volume. So although I talk about kind of compliance related measures like filing and paying, that's mainly because those are sometimes easiest to measure and what we were asked to look at. So to continue, you know, we can also look at different kinds of approaches and compare them against each other. We can look at, say, pointing out that most people have already paid for people who are late with, in this case, paying their local taxes in the UK. Does this have any impact? Do people care? Are they influenced by what others have done in the same situation? Or is it more effective to try and show visually where they are in the process, what's coming next, and to understand, you know, you want to avoid any future consequences by settling the matter now. As it turns out, if you test this, the standard letter, which we call control here, what the local government was using in the past, was producing around 57% payment rate on the first letter. We increased that by about 10 percentage points by pointing out the social norm. And the diagram had a similar kind of improvement. So you can start to make these kind of cost-benefit trade-offs between different options, and also, frankly, helping people understand better what is going on. Because it may be that the original communication, maybe there wasn't so much thought about where people are coming from, and maybe a visual representation makes a difference to getting people understanding where they are in the particular process for the tax authority. Okay, so we're talking fairly simple things right now, but it is really useful to have these empirical results to understand what makes difference. Otherwise, we may just be guessing. Here's an example of showing how this can happen at scale. I just talked about local government here. Let's go national. Indonesia has around 80% of the population of the US. We worked with their national tax authority, and this was not around a question of paying. This was more a demand management kind of thing from the tax authority, but had a real impact on taxpayers because people were waiting until the last minute to file their tax return. It was causing long lines at tax offices and collapsing the online filing system quite often. So if you can spread those filing events more widely, you won't have these problems. You'll get a better service. How do you do this? We worked with the tax authority to try emails. There's no evidence up until this point about whether a kind of preemptive email could make a difference to people. Maybe people will just ignore it. Emails are relatively low cost, and of course, most people have an email account. So these emails were sent out 6 weeks before the filing deadline. We wanted people to encourage filing at least 2 weeks before the deadline. We tried 1 of 6 emails or no email at all. So people were divided randomly into groups, and they either got no email or one of these 6 emails, one of which was developed by the tax authority. It was heavy on regulation. Another was simplified and shortened to get the messages across. A third one had links to guidance documents. A fourth one drew on behavioral science around planning. So we know there are certain things around asking people to make a plan when they'll file, makes it more likely they will do that. So it was a very simple message around plan when you're going to do this. The fifth one combined the guidance and planning messages, because of course it may be that they are complementary. And the last one was an appeal to national pride, showing what taxes are used for. And that was drafted by the tax authority and built on some work we did in Guatemala, actually, where that kind of appeal was effective. So interesting thing to note here is we're talking about 11 million people in this trial. So a lot of people, and that means that at scale, even small differences are substantive. So the results were that if you don't get any email, you have around 35% of taxpayers filing early. Now, that increases with pretty much every email, and these are significant differences in terms of whether we can be sure about whether they are real or not. They range from around a percentage point increase for the control email. So that's just the effect of sending an email, up to around 37% for the planning email, which was the best performer. Around 35,000 extra returns were filed early. That would have been around 250,000 if we'd sent the planning email to everybody. Again, these are marginal differences, but at scale. And also, as I mentioned, preventing the system from collapsing. So we also can see that this stuff is feasible to do at scale through emails as well. What about businesses? I've mentioned individuals. We also know that businesses can be influenced by these kinds of messages. This is an example from Mexico. And it wasn't so much around a more traditional paying or filing behavior, but it was around registering your business so that your employees could benefit from Social Security. And often there are not many incentives to do this, so it's a tough behavior to shift. What we did here was we tried one of three options, either no letter, which would be the standard approach, a letter which was focused on the penalties more for not registering, or again, this kind of social norms approach, saying that actually most employers do register, and encouraging the recipient to do the same. Both letters had the standard legal obligation involved and described the steps involved. So we weren't depriving any business of any information here. Again, so this is around businesses and it's around register employees. So again, we see that the letter was making a difference to registering this rather difficult behavior to shift. This is 14% more likely to have registered at least one employee 3 months after letters were sent. This is around 8,000 businesses we're talking about. And interestingly, and this is a theme I'm going to come back to, the deterrence and social norms messages had kind of the same effect. So there are wider options beyond the kind of deterrence approach that many authorities use. Okay, then, so I've talked about messages in general. Is it feasible and effective to build messages based on people's past activities? Here's an example from the UK. It was all about responding to what people had done in the past, and it also tried to compare to some extent SMS messages, text messages, and letters. So some people in this sample had a functioning mobile number for the UK tax authority, and some didn't. People who did got a text messages, the people who didn't got a letter. What did we do here? Well, this was for a group of individual taxpayers, and we identified people who had entered the system for the first time and been late the first time they had an opportunity. And those people, you might think, just didn't really know what they meant to be doing. So they got an educational message. Then we identified people who were repeatedly late over many years. And there it may be more effective to say, we've noticed you're repeatedly late. Can you please be on time? And then finally, and perhaps most interestingly, we also identified a group that had been late repeatedly, but the last time they paid on time. And so there you want to reinforce that behavior. You want to say, thank you for changing your approach and paying on time. Let's keep going. So what do we see here? So this graph shows the three different conditions, 3 different groups, sorry, and we can see that for all of the groups, the letters, and I'm talking just about the letters now, increase the proportion of people who paid on time. So these letters were sent before the deadline and trying to preempt any late payment by preemptively saying, look, in the past this happened, let's change things in the future. And in each of these, you can see at the deadline, people more likely to be on time. And in fact, 3 months after the deadline, they were also more likely to have paid. And that's important because at that point, the tax authority had been through collection actions. So this prevented people from having to go through that process because they paid on time. And you saw similar effects for each of the groups with these different approaches. The first-time debtors, the people who were repeatedly late, and the ones who, well, if you like, reformed. Then let's look at text messages. And interestingly, with text messages, the results were more mixed. In this slide, I've presented the results for the group that was recurring, the ones who are repeatedly late. And it shows that in this group, the text messages were effective. But for the other groups, for the ones who are new and for the ones who were reformed, we didn't see any impact of the text messages. So you might infer from this that still there is some additional impact of getting a physical letter from the tax authority. But of course, that costs more money. So there's a cost-benefit analysis to be made here, as with many things. Okay, final couple of examples. I talked about these general approaches, but really, we can be very specific about what precise wording makes a difference. And that's what we've done in the past with these randomized trials that only vary letters by, say, 1 sentence. And we know that it's that sentence that's making a difference. And you can find out more in the various academic articles, including one in the Journal of Public Economics that we published on the basis of this. So I'm just going to quickly explain this to you. We tried various different social norm messages, and I mentioned social norms earlier, but you can present this message in various different ways, like saying that most people in the UK have paid their tax on time. Most people in your local area have paid on time. Most people with a debt like yours have paid on time. Then you can combine these things. You can say you're currently in a small minority of people who haven't paid us yet, as opposed to pointing out that most people have paid. So there are various kind of different social norms. But someone may be sitting here saying, oh, well, that's all very interesting, but don't people just respond to fines, interest, those kind of things? Well, we also included financial information to try and find out if that's true. One message was just pointing out the different ways you could pay. Maybe people didn't realize the different ways they could pay that may be more convenient for them. And the final message was just pointing out that interest is being charged. How do these all play out? Well, first of all, we can see, and this is a group of 120,000 individual taxpayers, there's suggestive evidence that the more specific the norm is, the more closer it is to you, the more effective it is. And we have effects up to around 6 percentage points for the most specific kind of social norm. So the very wording of these messages makes a difference. Then if you look at the warning of interest, that is a comparable effect to the social norm. It's not blowing anything out of the water here. That warning of interest is around the same result as the other social norm messages. We're improving things. And in fact, it's pretty similar to simply providing people more information on the different ways to pay. So this is a group of individual taxpayers who've been late on their taxes, and the authority was trying to get them to pay what was owed. My final example, which I won't go into any depth, is just to make a more general point, that I've talked at a high level around messages that seem to work, but actually what really matters as well is who is responding differently. And so the final example is around many different messages that were tested again with individual taxpayers in the UK, but they come into 2 broad groups. One is the kind of softer approach, if you like, pointing out what you get for your taxes, pointing out that most people agree with paying, helping people to complete the process. And those are all the examples that are highlighted sort of in the blue markers on the right-hand side. And then in the red, there's the harder sort of messages saying, we'll be checking to see how long it takes you to respond, a more traditional approach from a tax authority, paying tax is the right thing to do, most people are paid, we'll be checking. Those are the more deterrence-focused approach messages. Okay, so here's the last result I want to show you. At the overall level, it seemed that it was only the deterrence messages that were making an impact to whether people paid after receiving this letter. But actually, this disguises some important differences. Actually, if you look at just the group of male taxpayers, that's where all the improvement and payment rates was coming from. It was having the effect was localized to just male taxpayers, as recorded in the HMRC system. In terms of female taxpayers, there was no impact, no significant impact of these deterrence messages. So there's something very important going on by different kinds of groups, and not only in terms of, say, identified gender, but also in terms of whether people have previously been late, because we also know that if for people who hadn't been late recently on their taxes, the simple reminder message of just like politely reminding you that your taxes are due had an impact. It improved payment rates. So did the messages around it's the right thing to do. They worked for people who hadn't been late previously, whereas for people who had been late in the past, they had no impact. So again, it's around who is responding differently. To sum up the takeaways, we know from hundreds of studies that the language and design of notices meaningfully influence how people respond. Changes can be implemented and tested at a very large scale. We have 11 million people in one of these studies. Businesses as well as individuals respond to these changes. Text messages can also work sometimes and are cheaper than letters often. Personalized letters that respond to the taxpayer's actions in the past can be effective. And the kind of softer approaches can be as effective as harder penalty type messages, particularly for some groups rather than others. That's my really quick tour of some things that have been learned over the past decade and a bit. There are many other kind of lessons to be learned, but I want to share these with you today. And thank you very much for your time. And please get in touch if you'd like to know more.
Well, Michael, that was just really terrific. And every time I listen to you, I have like 20,000 questions. I think it's so important to make that distinction between the types of taxpayers that you have and then the messages that resonate. And we had also had some folks on an earlier tax chat talking about the IRS study that recently came out about racial disparity in the audit selection process. And I think, to really test messages that resonate with different populations, not just on the basis of did you pay before, did you not pay before, sort of what you're getting at with the gender differences, is really interesting work. And it just made me remember that at one point, and that we in TASK were trying to do some messages, and we found in a letter that we sent before the filing season about to taxpayers who were claiming a particular tax credit for the working poor, that where we offered taxpayers the opportunity to call a dedicated toll-free line and get answers to your questions, we got very few people who actually called that line. I think we got 6 out of several thousand people we sent that letter to, but they showed improvement in their compliance that filing season. And that sort of, we found other studies in other areas that showed that it helped people think that they were doing the right thing if they knew that they could actually check somewhere later. It was really an interesting result, and I regret that we weren't able to explore that more. This does set up Josh's work nicely about trying to personalize messages and things like that. So Josh, I will start the screen share for you. We did have one question from Rochelle saying, what was the starting voluntary filing rates for the countries where these things were tested? Are they as high as the United States? So maybe, Michael, you could answer that while I'm getting the screen share up for Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. It really varies as well in the type of tax, because I went across individual, business, local, so it kind of varies really. The UK examples, I think compliance is perhaps, there's a different system, so you don't, the burden is different, but they're very comparable to the US and the UK examples. It varies by country.
Okay, Josh, your slides are up, so you tell me when you want me to move them along.
Sure. Great. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank Nina and the Center for Taxpayer Rights for inviting me here to share my observations and experiences over the years. As Nina mentioned, I've been with Taxpayer Advocate Service for a while now, since about 2005 in the Attorney Advisor Group, and have worked on this issue for some time, and just wanted to share my observations. But these aren't necessarily the opinions of TAS or the National Taxpayer Advocate, but are things that I've gleaned over the years from working on these projects. And before we get started, I just wanted to say that, like Nina, I found Michael's discussion really fascinating, and it reminded me, my wife's a psychologist in the schools, and when we're dealing with our own kids, she'll often tell me, I'll be just say, get off your iPad, or I'm taking a Pokemon card away or something. And she often reminds me, of positive reinforcement, when they get off the iPad quickly, then you give the Pokemon card. And, a lot of her work is observing students and how they learn and behave differently in the classroom. And, there's just really so many parallels to what Michael, I think, is talking about, to, tax admitted from other fields of psychology to tax administration. And there's a lot, we can learn and take with us as, the IRS is sort of exploring, I think, as Julie will talk about, opportunities that exist to really, improve outcomes for taxpayers. Because regardless of how we get there, that's really what everybody wants, is we want taxpayers to be able to resolve their issues, to know how to comply with their tax obligations, and know that they can depend on the IRS to help them do that. And my discussion is really going to talk about some of the challenges with notices and how notices, can be improved. So next slide, Nina. I just wanted to lay out some of the probably obvious challenges, which is that notices and IRS notices are often, they're unclear. They may bury information, in the notice that's really critical, or the information may be hard to find, or it's not there. Sometimes it's been omitted entirely, or, it's really being written from the IRS's perspective, like, this is what we need you to do, and if you don't do it, this is what's going to happen to you. And those are some of the challenges over the years that we've really tried to, work with the IRS to address. Okay, next slide. I just provided a few examples of what I would say are some of the more, the IRS sends out thousands of notices, and, even when you think like, okay, you have a lien notice or certain types of notice, a lot of times there's a lot of different versions of that notice. So, we send out a lot of notices, a lot of different notices. So this by no means is all inclusive, but through my work, these are some of the more challenging ones that, we've seen throughout the years, and kind of raise some issues with regarding the IRS. And without getting into the weeds too much, each and every one of these notices is delivering important information, from assessing a tax liability to, suspending the taxpayer from getting their refund, in many cases, which, is being generated by credits that are to help low-income taxpayers. Okay, next slide. I just wanted to talk about a few of the issues, and specifically with certain notices. So math error notices, like I said, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but they basically, at least initially, there's this process in which the IRS can bypass its normal deficiency procedures, and if taxpayers don't respond in a certain amount of time to get the tax abated, then they lose their right to go to tax court, which is a prepayment forum. And these notices are sort of notoriously unclear. They don't really tell exactly what the adjustment is that's being made. And up until recently, they really didn't highlight that 60-day critical time period in the notice. Now, through our work with the IRS together, we have been able to get most of those math error notices to put that 60-day time period up on I believe, the right-hand corner of the notice. But that was a challenge initially as well. Okay, next slide is what we call refund fraud notices. So as I mentioned before, these notices are telling taxpayers like, hey, wanted to let you know we have some questions about your return. This is not what the notice sounds like. This is what I sound like trying to summarize it. But we have some questions about your return. We're going to hold on to it till we feel, we look into it a little bit more. And once we do, if we feel comfortable and the information's been verified, we'll release it. Well, these notices really give scant information, and there's somewhat of a good reason for that, which is, they've been identified that of possible fraud. So, the IRS's perspective, at least, is you don't want to tell the person exactly what you're doing. On the other hand, the IRS has had a pretty high false positive or detection rate on these, about 50%. Or even north of that. So many of these taxpayers who are receiving these notices are legitimate. Their return is legitimate. And they're thinking like, whoa, what happened? What did I do? What do I need to do? And who do I call? Do I need to call someone? Do I need to send information in? And they've really had a hard time getting that information. So, that's a notice that we've talked about over the years and tried to make improvements to. The next slide and the next example is something that's called combination letters. And those are primarily used in examinations where, the IRS is sending a letter that's telling the taxpayer two different things, where they're usually in correspondence audits or exams, and they're saying, we have a question, you need to send us information to substantiate this issue, this claim on your return. And hey, by the way, we're also including this 30-day notice. And if you don't do this within this time period, we're going to send out a statutory notice of deficiency, which really, starts the clock for making an assessment unless the taxpayer exercises the right to go to tax court. So again, critical information, but those dual notices often leave taxpayers confused and sort of bewildered as what to do. So I set that out just to sort of set the stage as like, these are some of the challenges. These are just examples, but I think you really could apply these challenges to many notices that, there's confusion. We're maybe asking taxpayers or telling taxpayers multiple things at once. We're not telling them enough information. And they really walk away, in some cases, really feeling frustrated and not knowing where to turn and where to go, because some of the service issues we've had over the years, if they do come into us to the IRS, it's hard to, they may not be able to get the service that they need. Now, there's so much that's changing in the IRS, and they're aware of a lot of these issues and making strides to address them. But I'm kind of talking about, how it's been in the past or perhaps the status quo. Okay, so next slide is opportunities to, really improve notices. What are some ideas to make notices better? So Michael, talked a lot about, sending out different notices to different groups, and the IRS has tried to do this, especially a few years ago in its automated collection function, with sort of varying degrees of success of trying to send out notice. Now, some of those notices were really trying to get, at least from my perspective, one of the primary objectives was really to get taxpayers to start to do stuff on their own and stop calling the IRS because they were inundated, with calls. And, that's not always, that objective, if you're going into it, that is maybe going to yield different results. Now, what we've talked about is really having a taxpayer rights framework in these notices. And then the other issue is that there's the single point of contact for taxpayers, when they receive that notice, so they know exactly who to call. So, okay, next slide, just a little bit more information on the taxpayer rights framework. So you may be aware that years ago, the IRS adopted the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And one thing that we had talked about and we've worked on for some time is that those really need to be fully incorporated into the IRS's culture, including our notices. So, you'd see an example here where we say, we're writing, the taxpayer rights gives you the right to quality service and the right to be informed. To observe these rights, we want to inform you that you have this much due. Here's how you can pay, and you have a right to a fair and just tax system that will consider all your facts and circumstances. And really making that sort of the framework when you're developing these notices. So the next slide talks about that single point of contact issue, which is just that when we send out these notices, and Michael touched on this too, is that, you would say there's been research that has shown that, if you say, hi, this is Josh with the IRS, we're contacting you regarding a outstanding liability, please contact me. Here's my number so we can, discuss this, or here's how to set up a time to discuss this with me. That personal connection yields better responses in some instances with taxpayers. And currently, especially in our automated collection function, a lot of what we do is we shoot out notices and we hope the IRS or the taxpayer calls. We don't really make calls to taxpayers. And one thing I've always thought about or advocated for, there's a process that I believe in exam that is it's not really a field examination, which is like someone going to your business or meeting with you in their office to talk about an examination, but it's not really a correspondence examination. It's something in between, where we would send out and, is there an opportunity to do something like that for collection, where we would send out one of those personalized notice and really try to work with the taxpayer. Okay, the next slide talks about response rates, how to increase that response rates. And we had done a study some years ago that was mainly with collection notices that really that found that there was a marginal improvement in response rates for when we sent out monthly sort of reminder notices when compared to sending out the notice of federal tax lien. So we're going to put a lien on your property. So those nudges, letting taxpayers know, like, this is where things stand, and just keeping that correspondence and that communication open. Now, I think one thing to keep in mind, because I think we're considering, just all sorts of opportunities in the IRS, how to, improve response rates. And, more notices are great, but I think to Michael's point, they need to be the right kind of notices. And I also think the notices need to mirror the reality of our tax administration system. So, if we're sending out a notice and we want it to be taxpayer friendly and customer service, then the other part of that is what we're putting out there in that notice. We have to back up in how we're serving taxpayers. We have to make sure we're answering the phones. We have to make sure the assisters that are answering the phones are providing good, reliable, accurate, and clear information. We have to make sure we have easy, accessible technology that can be used. We have to make sure that our website is easy to find information on, or make payment arrangements. So, and get documents to electronically to taxpayers. And there's so much of that in the works. But my point here is that, it's not necessarily just about sending out more notices. There's so much more that has to be considered. Okay, so next slide here. One thing I just wanted to touch on is some accessibility issues with notices. And there was a settlement a few years ago with two taxpayers. The suit was brought by the National Federation of the Blind regarding the accessibility of notices. They couldn't read them. There was no way to get accessible notices. And the IRS ended up settling this out of court. And as you can see in the next slide, they have started providing, part of the settlement was they started providing more accessible notices. So Braille, large print, plain text, electronic versions. Now, the good thing about this is there's a process in which the taxpayer can call or send in a form, and they'll say, I want to receive notices in this, in this fashion. And then an indicator is put on their account. And then from that point forward, the notices should go out in that format. And if for some reason they don't, and say they get assessed penalties, that possibly could be used as a factor in when considering reasonable cause for penalty relief, for penalty abatement down the road. I point this out just, because one, it's interesting, but it's also something that's I feel sort of passionate about, and I'm encouraging everybody who will listen to me as we start down the road of notices, notice redesign, and just technology, leveraging technology, for all types of communication as a result of implementing new systems from the increased funding that the IRS has received, is that we have to make sure that these systems, whether it be notices, or you putting notices on the taxpayer's online account, or an e-file system that the IRS is setting up, we have to make sure that they're accessible to all, including those with disabilities. And from my experience, in some instances, those groups are an afterthought, and they get something designed, and then they say, they get something designed, and then they say, oh yeah, we got to make this accessible. And then you're hodgepodging things, and it doesn't work as well. So I believe, my understanding is that the IRS is really working hard to think about these issues up front. But one issue that has come up too, or that we've had to think about, is like QR codes. Those are awesome, and we're adding them to notices. That's a really great feature. But we have to be careful not to omit really important, valuable information from the notice and just put it in the QR code, because some people may not be able to use that QR code because of disabilities or a variety of other issues, internet issues, and just, a lot of other issues. And like they always say, everybody's going to age into disability at some point. So it's something for all of us to think about. Okay, next slide. I just wanted to touch here on here is just say, TAS has been working hard with the IRS for a long time, and we have a lot of really good relationships with people, and how to improve the system for notices and notice redesigns. And we have a good working relationship with so many people in those offices. One thing that I think has been achieved recently is to identify sort of high priority or significant notices that are going out that are high impact, and making sure they have language in there about TBOR, taxpayer rights, and TAS, and the low-income taxpayer clinics. We've also, as I mentioned, we were able to work with them to make some improvements to map their notices, although unfortunately they still don't really specify the error that's being adjusted, and we have a legislative recommendation that be required legislatively. But I think there were some technology issues that were preventing them from doing that. So I'm hoping maybe with all the changes, that's something that might be changed in the future. Okay, and then lastly, just to sort of tee up Julie here, so she can tell you all the wonderful things that are happening and how all the things I've discussed are going to not be as an issue anymore. The strategic operating plan that was released a few months ago, really identifies areas of improvement that they're striving to do, and in certain areas I believe have already been done impressively over the previous few months. So there's a lot of effort going on this, and we're happy to be able to participate in those discussions. And then the last couple slides are just resources. I took a lot of my information from some of our annual reports or some blogs that we've done in the past. So I wanted you all to have access to those in case you want more details. It has a lot more information about the data. So I am done with the presentation. I did hear a comment that came in about how to request the accessibility options on your for taxpayers for notices, and there's a form, and I don't have the number on top of my mind, but I don't know, Nina, if there's a way to maybe get something like that on the center's website or something. Oh, I think Susan just sent it out. So you can fill out that form, or you can call and request that indicator be put on the taxpayer's account.
So, thank you, Josh. There's a lot of information in there, and we will put on our website, we're building a page with all sorts of materials associated with the video, and we'll put the settlement agreement for the National Federation, the Blind, what the IRS agreed to do. It's really an incredible document. We are seeing comments saying, how do people know that this ability is out there? And I think that goes to broader issues of the IRS really reaching out to the population. I wanted to talk, your chat raised a few things of, what I've personally worked on over the years. I think the first time that I wrote about math error in the annual report to Congress and made a legislation was back in 2004. And there, with my research into the legislative history, when the IRS got the authority to go beyond changing things summarily on a return, going 2 + 2 = 5, when it went beyond math error to what they call clerical errors, Congress wrote both in the House committee report and the Senate committee report that gave the IRS this legislative authority, that they wanted very specific descriptions of what were the discrepancies, what was entered on one line and what was entered on the other, or what was missing. And in the legislative history, in the committee reports, they give the example of a person lists, say, 6 dependents on the front of the 1040, and yet they multiply the dependency exemption, which nobody's doing right now, but okay, so the child tax credit, but back in 76, they multiplied the dependency exemption by 7. And the example was they wanted the IRS to send a letter saying, on line this, you entered 6 dependents, but on line this, you multiplied times 7. We have adjusted for 6, but if this isn't the correct answer, please call us and tell us. Now, there's not a lot of legislative history that goes into that kind of detail. And that was 1976. And here we are, 2023, and the IRS has still not gotten to that level. And that is why it was like, well, now you need to have a legislative recommendation to make the IRS get to that level. And I understand the technology issues, but if you take a taxpayer rights and taxpayer centric perspective, you will do that. And you will find a way. And that also will reduce phone calls and things like that, and help your employees too. The other thing I wanted to talk about, just because I'm using this to give some history, is that in 2004 and 2005, I negotiated with the Deputy Commissioner for Service and Enforcement an agreement, and there is a memorandum of understanding, which probably no one has except for me anymore, whereby the IRS would not use combination letters with respect to earned income credit or the child tax credit or other things, because we were feeling that those taxpayers were unlikely to be represented and would not understand that this choice that you're being told in a letter, you are under audit. And at the same time, oh, by the way, you have 30 days to request an appeal. Now, what is that taxpayer supposed to do? Are they supposed to continue to work with the audit people, or do they request an appeal? But if they request an appeal, will that make the auditor angry at them and they'll get some repercussions? This is, taxpayers thinking. I personally think the IRS, although they're trying to save money, it is a violation of taxpayer rights to combine those letters, and that practice should be stopped for everyone. That's my personal opinion. The last thing I wanted to talk about before I introduce Julie was the study that Josh mentioned about, ACS and sending out different messages and having the goal of eliminating calls into the IRS. What was really interesting about that study was that the IRS purposely did not put any phone numbers on those messages. They were trying to drive the taxpayer, in addition to giving them different messages, they were trying to drive the taxpayer to going to the online installment agreement and entering their own, and entering into an installment agreement. And what they found was that, taxpayers didn't call the ACS line because the number wasn't on there. But what those numbers did do was drive volume to other phone lines. Like taxpayers were calling all over the place, any IRS number they could find, in order to get a response. So I think, again, you really have to think about what your motivation is. If you're taking a taxpayer-centric perspective and somebody owes you money, you really do want to, some of them are going to need to talk to you, and you need to find out what groups of them really need to talk to you to get a resolution, as opposed to what groups are very happy going to online tools. And I have not seen that kind of sophisticated work coming yet from the IRS, and I would encourage that. So moving on to Julie, now that I've had my, say, but that's okay because I'm the host. The initiative 2.3, the strategic operating plan that the IRS has released, has an objective 2, which is quickly resolve taxpayer issues when they arise. And strategic operating plan initiative 2.3 says, to Josh's point, develop taxpayer centric notices. And there are a lot of pieces underneath this plan. And what I was hoping Julie could talk about is what's going on in a positive way in the IRS, but at the same time also give some background. For example, one of the key projects is improve technology so notices can be updated without coding or system changes. And there's this little data point in that project, which says use technology to accelerate updates and digitalize the content of notices with the aim of increasing the current rate of 5 to 7 notices per year. 5 to 7 notices per year. That's what it takes. And that's what the capabilities are right now in the current state of the IRS, increasing it to as many as 500 per year. And that would be a game changer. And again, it's the constraints of the technology in so many ways that have held the IRS back to changing notices. So Julie, I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you for that, Nina, and thank you for the invitation. I have to say it's been an excellent conversation so far. I think it's done a really good job of illustrating just how complex and multifaceted an issue like notices is, even though on its face it really sounds like a pretty simple thing. But that said, what I'd like to do is I'll certainly address the points you mentioned, but I also want to talk a bit about 3 different topics. A little bit about our transformation initiatives, the people, the goals, the efforts that we have underway, a few accomplishments that we've already got under our belts, and then I have an ask for the folks on the line here. As you mentioned, Nina, we're talking about Initiative 2.3. It's Taxpayer Centric Notices, and I appreciate the fact that you're going to add a copy of the Strategic Operating Plan to the materials related to this conversation. I think that'll make things a lot easier for folks to reference. The first thing I want to mention, and maybe it's the most important thing, are the people who are part of this initiative. Our projects, and we have 8 of them, are led by folks who are already working to improve notices in the IRS, and they have a great deal of experience in this space. Most importantly, I think the chief of the Office of Taxpayer Correspondence, or OTC, her office is located in Media and Publications, which is part of W&I. OTC manages the design, the development, the planning, the delivery of all correspondence that is issued by the IRS. So definitely a key point when it comes to notices, and she's part of all of our projects. We also have counsel, we have RAS. For those who aren't familiar with RAS, that's Research, Applied Analytics, and Statistics. IRS IT is, you'll be happy to know, a significant contributor to our projects. We also have all of the operating divisions who issue notices, and then all of the functions and offices who are impacted by those notices. We have the Taxpayer Experience Office. We have a number of folks from the Taxpayer Advocate Service. We've got appeals, we've got counsel, we've got the communications folks. And so really all of this is to say that there is great support across the IRS for this initiative. And there are a lot of folks who are highly invested in making sure that we succeed in accomplishing our goals. And I think that's going to be extremely helpful. But speaking of our goals, they're largely reflected in the SOP, but just to condense them to a little nutshell here, we want to create better notices, and we want all of our notices to be better, not just some, not just the worst of them. And so what does that mean? Well, we want them to be clearly written, obviously. We want them to be concise. I'm pretty sure we can say in 2 or 3 pages what we need to, and we don't have to take 20 or 30 pages. We want to reflect in those notices the great respect we have for taxpayers. Like Josh said, we want to personalize them. We want to use the right tone. And most importantly, whether a notice is easy to understand or not, it should be determined by you, by tax professionals, by taxpayers, and not only by the IRS. And I think that's going to be one of the most significant changes that comes from this initiative. And you might notice a trend in that regard here as we move through this conversation. We also want our notices, all of our notices, to be easy to respond to. Taxpayers should be able to upload documents responsive to those notices using perhaps our document upload tool, or maybe they prefer a secure portal, or maybe they prefer a live chat or a chat bot. And some folks might prefer the US mail because not everybody prefers digital options. And that's not just every taxpayer, that's also not every tax professional prefers digital options. Just because you are an excellent advocate for taxpayers may not necessarily mean that you're comfortable on the bleeding edge of technology. So really in a nutshell, the IRS needs to meet taxpayers where they are, and we need to meet tax professionals where you are. And then going back to that common theme, whether a notice is easy to respond to, again, should be determined by you, should be determined by taxpayers, and not only by the IRS. We also, like you and Josh alluded to, we need to update notices quickly as those updates become necessary. We need to update notices often so that those notices stay current, they stay relevant, and how we prioritize which notices we're going to update and how we're going to update them really needs to depend a lot on your needs and taxpayers' needs and preferences and priorities, and not just those of the Internal Revenue Service. We also, as part of this initiative, intend to measure what matters. I mean, not the least of those things would be taxpayer satisfaction and your satisfaction. And we measure those things really not just to hold ourselves accountable, but frankly, just to make sure that we are doing a good job. And we need to talk. We need to get your input. We need to give you feedback. And we need to make this a transparent process. Right now, Josh mentioned QR codes. We're looking to get your input through those QR codes on notices themselves. We're looking at survey portals on online accounts. We're investigating links on the Tax Pros section of irs.gov. We're looking into partnering with the Taxpayer Experience Office and with TAS, and of course the tried and true face-to-face conversations are tried and true for a good reason. And in addition to compiling and organizing and incorporating your feedback into the update of various notices, it's going to be just as important that we reach back to you to share what we've learned from your feedback and to show how we've used your feedback in improving our notices very specifically. And if we're not using feedback, then we need to take that opportunity to explain what it is and why we're not using it. Because really, if this isn't a transparent process, it's just not going to be a workable process. So from there, I wanted to mention a few things that we have in progress now, keeping in mind that our initiative is pretty young yet. So we're just getting our sea legs, but we've already got quite a few things to share. We've begun reaching out to our external stakeholders, for example, and we have a plan to reach out a lot more broadly. Thanks to Frank Bustos and TAS, we've already participated in a meeting with TAP and have had some really good conversations there. We'll participate in the ERSAC meeting later this month. We're meeting with the ABA later this week. I can thank Keith Fogg and Mary Slonina for that. We had a very helpful conversation with enrolled agent Bob Kerr and his colleagues who reached out to us through the Taxpayer Experience Office. And we're also reaching out to, this might surprise folks, but we're reaching out to our internal stakeholders as well, because the folks who produce the notices, who hear from taxpayers, who can spot those issues, probably have also been thinking about not just the issues, but potential solutions for quite some time as well. So we want to make sure that we hear those from them. Nina, you mentioned our technology challenges, and we have a few. But we are in the process of procuring technology. It is, I actually expect that procurement to be complete later this month. We're procuring technology that will help improve the look and feel of our notices, because as you know, they come from a variety of different places. We have a correspondex system, we have the CP notices, we've got repository letters, we've got PDFs on folks' computers, and all of those not just have a different content, which we're addressing separately, but they also have a different look and feel, and there's a certain lack of consistency there. And then of course, the correspondence letters have a certain dot matrix printer aesthetic that not many of us really appreciate. But this technology will bring all of those systems under its umbrella, and we'll be able to incorporate some consistency, not just in the look and feel, but also in terms of the functionality. For example, the correspondence system also doesn't provide for QR codes. With this technology, we expect that it will. So that is going to be a huge benefit to us. And like I say, we expect to have that benefit this month. Digitization of notices is well underway. As we digitize notices, we're also able to put them on taxpayers' online accounts. So for taxpayers who are looking for kind of a one-stop shopping experience with the IRS, online accounts may be exactly what they're looking for. And I'd encourage folks to create their own online account and kind of go in, explore, and see what's available to them there. It's a great resource. We also use a behavioral insights tool, and Michael's presentation made me think of that and want to share that with you. But it certainly helps us create smarter notices, and when combined with all of the other improvements that we're implementing, I think it's going to be a significant part of the much improved notices that we're planning on. And then I'll mention that we have also had some very helpful input from the IRS's Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion that has helped us look at notices in very different ways. And that has been wonderful. Now, I thought I'd end with an ask, because I never like to miss an opportunity to ask for things. Maybe that's a result of so many years with the government, but we talked about collecting your feedback and your input and your ideas and your insights, and we'd like to do that in 3 different ways. The first of which is just to collect your ideas about which notices are most in need of an update, why they're in need of an update, and exactly the kind of update that you think would make them a much more efficient, effective, helpful notice for taxpayers. We expect to recreate our prioritization schedule by the end of this fiscal year. So this is a pretty immediate need. We'd like to incorporate all of the input that we receive from our external stakeholders and partners, and incorporate that in this prioritization schedule. And that should be available at the end of September. We'd also like feedback on draft notices. And this is a more limited ask because we're going to use tests, we're going to use focus groups, we're going to have conversations with ERSAC and ETAC and TAP. ERSAC, for those folks who may not be familiar with it, the Internal Revenue Service Advisory Council. ETAC is the Electronic Tax Administration Advisory Committee, and along with the Taxpayer Advisory Panel, that's a lot of abbreviations, they have all executed non-disclosure agreements. And for that reason, we expect to work with them on draft notices because we think it would be very confusing for taxpayers if drafts were to perhaps circulate at all. So we intend to collect feedback that way. If you're participating on one of those panels, I look forward to working with you. If you're not, but know someone who is, channeling your feedback to them may be helpful. And then finally, we expect to ask on a regular basis for your feedback on notices. Like Nina mentioned, we are substantially increasing the rate at which we update notices in order to keep them current and relevant and helpful. And you might expect that at least we may do a survey annually, or it may be just an email box or a link or a portal that is open all the time. But we expect to continually collect your feedback, your input, your suggestions, your ideas, in order to constantly update notices to keep them helpful. I guess to sum things up, much of this is really still in process, and Nina, I'll provide you an email address if you could associate that with the notes from this conversation so that folks have a place to respond to. That would be fabulous.
Great.
And I look forward to working with everybody.
So thank you, Julie. So we've got a lot of comments in the chat, and I'm going to try to work through them. There are a couple that were about the actual, the notices themselves, can you share drafts of revised notices before it is too late to incorporate feedback, even versions that are clearly improvements? There may be additional ways to improve that become clear only by seeing the near final revised version, including such things as converting to plain language that gives the critical information accurately but more clearly, such as referring to owing money rather than liabilities. And then someone else, commented, a comprehensive list of all notices and posting those notices on the IRS website in a searchable way, like forms and pubs, would be helpful. So on that last one, I'd say that, at least Taxpayer Advocate Service is a taxpayer roadmap. And I keep wanting to promote this because if you go and you Google taxpayer roadmap, you'll get to the website where they've not only, we designed the taxpayer roadmap that looks like the Metro map, but it's now electronic. And so where there is a notice listed on that roadmap like CP11 or CP12, you can click on that and you'll see a diagram of that notice with plain language descriptions of what the key things are saying. It will also have links to where you can get more information. It will also have a quick pop-up that says, here are the things you need to do. Here's some key things. Here are your rights with respect to this notice. And here's where you can get help. And that's where information is about LITCs or tasks or whatever. So, but I think that looking at the roadmap and then thinking about how that could be done broader, I think would be really interesting. It will also show you the stunning amount of notices that are out there, because at least in my experience, every time you turn around, there's another notice. On the thing, I wanted to push back a little bit, Julie, on the, sharing things with entities that do not have non-disclosure agreements. I know that in the past, when I've worked with IRS on notices, and even as far back as 2004, 2005, when we were developing a form for earned income credit affidavits, we did share the form with representatives of the low-income taxpayer clinic community, because they were the people who represented these folks. And ERSAC may not be representing these folks, and TAP, they may not be representing these taxpayers. And yet the LITC and the VITA folks absolutely worked with these taxpayers every single day of their lives and had perspectives on the forms that, even though I have an LITC background, I didn't see those things. And it really made the form much better, particularly watching out for various language issues. And then this is sort of a question, which is, one person asked, what is the timeline to update a notice and what steps are involved in updating notices? Do divisions have to approve? So I don't know whether Josh or Julie want to answer that, but I think that's really important so people can understand just how in the current environment, it's so restrictive, this process, and why you only get 5 to 7 a year.
Maybe Josh, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to tackle that one. And maybe I'll start with, last in, first out. So as far as the clearance process, which is what we affectionately call moving a draft notice to a final product, it will include probably some informal communication with the business unit whose notice that is, together with their counsel office, their TAS point of contact, and maybe others. And then when it's in what they think is a final shape, it'll go through clearance, then reviewed by TAS and counsel. And this can be a pretty time-consuming process, as you can imagine. And there's very often, and I've had the misfortune to contribute to this, but there's very often a fair bit of back and forth, which further extends the period of time it takes to move that notice out. Because that is such an inefficient process, and because the SOP charges us, like you mentioned, with updating as many as 500 notices a year, we have a separate project led by an attorney in W&I that is really dedicated to the clearance process to make sure that there's sufficient input, that notices are legally sufficient, but that we meet that 500 notice year goal, which is not to say that every year that many notices will need to be updated, but nevertheless, we need to update whatever number it is that needs to be updated. Josh, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I just did a huge sigh of relief when you said, "Can I cover this question?" I was like, "Oh, good." No, but I just will say that TAS is part of that process right now. I'm sure we'll have a role, in any future process that's developed. And to Julie's point, it can be a cumbersome process, and I'm sure it's a balancing act where TAS and others still want an opportunity to raise concerns. But yet we don't want to, we want to be an efficient, fast process. Right now, we'll review notices, and then we will, if we have concerns, we'll raise them through in a process, and then the IRS can rebuttal, and we can go back and forth until either the IRS finally can agree or say, no, we don't, we're just not going to come to an agreement on this, and then in TAS we will have to elevate that in a higher level. So that's how the process currently works for us, and I'm sure we'll have a role in any future process to raise any issues that we see.
So, we're kind of coming up to the, oh, Julie, did you want to say something more?
Oh, I just wanted to say Josh is exactly right, and TAS is a member on that very small team of folks working a new clearance process.
So I'm going to end our conversation here with a question that I think is really relevant that I'm going to throw out to Julie and Josh, and then hand it over to Michael since he's been listening, so that he can close it out with any words of wisdom or suggestions as the agency moves forward with trying to do, more notice clarity. And Michael, no pressure on you at all. So the comment was, I've been involved in various notice revamping, and I swear I didn't write this comment. I've been involved in various notice revamping exercises since the early 1990s. What is different now that will make this notice effort a success for taxpayers where previous efforts have failed? So Josh, and Julie, that's a question for you all.
Can I just go to one part of that, which is, especially for the external stakeholders, one thing that we talked about in our most recent annual report in the transparency most serious problems section is we had a recommendation in there that a review of informal guidance like forms, instructions, publications, and I think notices should be included in this. There should be a review process for external stakeholders that mirrors that of the review process for formal guidance. As I think many people know, if we have proposed regulations, then there's a process where everybody, is going to have an opportunity to comment on them, and then those comments will be considered, not necessarily adopted, but if they're not, there's usually an explanation. And we, like I said, we made a similar recommendation for informal guidance, and I think to the extent possible, it would really make sense for the IRS to consider opportunities for external stakeholders to have a process that's similar to that we have for formal guidance. So, I mean, that's just my little plug.
Julie?
Maybe I can answer it 3 times if that's okay. With respect to what Josh said, I think I would agree with 99% of it, and that is that external stakeholders need to be a critical part of every aspect of this process, and that all by itself is going to make a significant difference. I wouldn't necessarily treat it in such a formal way, only because there's a fair bit of time associated with that. And another key aspect is going to be the fact that we're going to be able to update notices very quickly. The clearance process seems to be a little bit of a sticker right now, and the technology is not, which is interesting for a change. But being able to update things quickly where a mistake is recognized, a better way is recognized, an additional thought or comment or improvement is spotted is also going to make a significant difference. I would also, actually maybe I'll answer it 4 ways, but quickly. The technology that we have, the bringing everything together and eliminating that dot matrix aesthetic is going to be incredibly helpful as well. And then I would just cap it off by saying that there is that incredibly broad-based support across the IRS is, I don't know, I imagine we've had it before. I haven't been in this position to know, but it is nothing but helpful. So I'll leave it there.
You know, when you were talking about fixing errors, this brought a memory where I can't remember what year it was, but I think it was the notice of deficiency, but it might have been the collection due process notice, where there was an effort to improve that notice, and TAS was actually involved, and my own former employees suggested a change in the goal of simplifying the language. And part of that simplifying was removing the reference to the United States Tax Court, which, you know, the notice gives you the right to go to the tax court within a certain amount of time. And the judges, several of the special trial judges actually gave show cause orders to chief counsel to show that this was actually a notice of deficiency, a valid notice of deficiency. And, you know, I heard about that and started, you know, was ready to roar at everyone until I found out it was my own employees who, in the best of efforts and intention, thought, well, this is just a lot of information. Let's just not put this on. And it was just like, no, you know, there's certain things that need to be on, and, you know, who caught that? And so there's a combination there of what's your focus. You know, you both have to have the legal focus, the taxpayer rights-based focus, the clarity focus. Simplifying can often mean you're giving wrong information. And so you have to make sure that, you know, that's the conversation about simplexity that we had on an earlier tax chat, that you don't make something so simple that it's incorrect. And then the other piece is what you just said, Julie, the ability to correct, change, you know, identify errors or improvements and then make those changes quickly. It took a while, even though everybody agreed that was wrong, to get that changed. And, you know, that's just a real challenge. So Michael, you get to wrap it up.
Thanks very much. And yeah, I think one big thing which came out, which someone mentioned, was this idea that it is really hard, I think, in working in a bureaucracy, to imagine what it's like not to be intimately involved with the operation you're running. And I've written stuff about this before, about like the illusion of similarity. You can be so involved in your piece of the system, you forget that people have no knowledge of what's going on. And that can mean you make assumptions and neglect things that would make a real difference. So that kind of input and that kind of perspective, taking the ability to see it from another angle, from the outside angle, I think is extremely important. And it's one other thing, which I'm not sure the practical implication here, but the vast majority, if not all, the interactions you have with the tax authority are neutral or negative. Is there any role for positive? And you've got to get that right, because you don't want to annoy people with it. But I do feel that when people are doing the right thing and making the effort to do the right thing, that should be recognized. And I think there are feasible ways of doing that, to reinforce when people have made the effort to do the right thing.
That's really important. Well, this has been a great conversation, and I want to thank everyone in the chat, in the audience. I'm just really thrilled with this conversation. There's a lot to look out for. We will post some of the materials from Behavioral Insight Team. I'll follow up with Michael about where he's written about that last piece that you were discussing. It'd be great to link to some of the materials. And I want to thank our guests, Michael, Josh, and Julie, for coming and spending an hour and a half with us. Coming up next week is collection, IRS collection, and also international taxpayers and newcomers to the United States. So that we have 2 tax chats next week that we'll be dealing with, and certainly communication issues are going to be part of both of those discussions. So see you next week. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.